Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor today to oppose the confirmation of David Chipman, President Biden's nominee for Director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Many Hoosiers are concerned about the nomination of Mr. Chipman, and rightfully so. His statements have made one thing clear. If confirmed, he will fail to uphold the constitutional right to bear arms. He has stated under oath that he supports mandatory federal registration of common semi-automatic firearms and ultimately supports a ban on AR-15 rifles. Semi-automatic sporting rifles can be found in the homes of millions of law-abiding Americans, Hoosiers included, who use them for hunting, recreational shooting, and defending their families. The ATF has a responsibility to clearly articulate its decisions to the public. In his confirmation hearing, Mr. Chipman revealed that he is not able to articulate what an assault rifle even is. His beliefs represent, in my opinion, a direct attack on our Second Amendment rights. It's no surprise that organizations that have never opposed an ATF nominee before are loudly opposing the nomination of David Chipman. The ATF Accountability Act, Mr. Chipman's nomination comes as the ATF is already in need of more accountability for politicized decisions. American gun owners, manufacturers, and small business owners deserve clarity and the right to appeal politicized decisions made by the ATF. Currently, the ATF engages in secretive, behind-the-scenes classification, a review process to decide if a firearm will be regulated by the National Firearms Act. No law-abiding American should have to wonder if they are going to suddenly be made a criminal by a bureaucratic decision. It doesn't make sense. That is why I joined Representative Dan Crenshaw in the House to introduce the ATF Accountability Act. Law-abiding gun manufacturers and small businesses should be able to appeal the legal status or classifications within a regular time frame. And I yield the floor at this time.
The senator from Montana.
Mr. President, thank you. I want to thank my friend and my colleague, Senator Braun, for leading this important discussion on protecting the Second Amendment rights for Montanans and for all Americans. Mr. President, today, President Biden and Chuck Schumer are propping up yet another very controversial nominee, one that far from unites us as Americans, rather another nominee that divides us further. Sadly, we're witnessing a complete disregard for our Constitution. And the Constitution could not be clearer. And now I know why my Democratic colleagues may want to say it otherwise, but it's clear. It's very clear when it says, and I have my pocket Constitution here, it says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's very strong and very clear language. Montanans and the American people are guaranteed this rights as protected in our Constitution. Despite this, we've seen President Biden and far-left Democrats abandon this right to fit their own gun-grabbing agenda. Their latest attack on the Second Amendment is the nomination of a registered anti-gun lobbyist who has called for the ban of certain firearms to lead the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. This is the very agency that oversees firearms. It's unbelievable. In putting David Chipman in charge of the ATF is like putting an arsonist in charge of the fire department. He has a very hostile record towards the Second Amendment, and this hostile record against law-abiding gun owners speaks loud and clear. It's interesting, look at the 2020 data that's coming in. 40% of the firearms sold in our country last year were to first-time buyers of a firearm. 40%. Why? The American people want to be able to defend themselves as we're seeing the far left push to defund law enforcement, defund the police. When we see the anarchy going on across the cities of America, the lawlessness, the high murder rates, the violence, it's no wonder that more Americans now say, I want to own a firearm myself to protect myself. If confirmed, Mr. Chipman would help the Democrats push their gun-grabbing agenda. We can't allow the left to continue this attack on our precious constitutional rights. David Chipman would be a disaster to the Second Amendment rights of Montanans and all Americans. The Senate must oppose Mr. Chipman's nomination for the sake of protecting our Second Amendment rights. We must also pass some common sense legislation that protects the Second Amendment, like what Senator Braun of Indiana is trying to do with his ATF accountability. I support him in his efforts to pass this common sense legislation. I urge all my colleagues to join me in opposing Mr. Chipman's nomination to lead the ATF and encourage my colleagues to pass and support Senator Braun's ATF Accountability Act. And Mr. President, I yield back my time to the Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Indiana.
Here in a moment, I'm going to ask for unanimous consent on the ATF Accountability Act and the Protecting the Right to Keep and Bear Arms Act. Governor Cuomo has declared gun violence a public health emergency in New York. We want to do with gun violence what we just did with COVID, Governor Cuomo says. During the pandemic, Governor Cuomo and other elected officials used the public health emergency to infringe upon Americans' constitutional rights. They barred Americans from exercising their freedom of religion by closing churches. They infringed upon Americans' right to assemble by banning many gatherings. And now, gun control activist organizations are pressuring President Biden to declare gun violence as a public health emergency. Doing so would allow the administration to take executive action to hold up gun sales. Declaring a public health emergency should not give the executive branch the right to infringe upon our Second Amendment. This is why I introduced the Protecting the Right to Keep and Bear Arms Act to stop this. This bill would prevent the White House from declaring an emergency for the purpose of imposing gun control. Took an oath to represent Hoosiers and protect their Second Amendment rights. That is why I will oppose the nomination of David Chipman and why I will ask for unanimous consent to pass the ATF Accountability Act and the Protecting the Right to Keep and Bear Arms Act. Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 1920 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered, read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Majority Whip.
I read this bill, and I'm not sure that the senator from Indiana really wants to do what this bill says, because the bill makes it a priority at this agency, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, a priority if there is a request from a licensed manufacturer, importer, or dealer, a request of the agency for information, questions on regulatory matters, puts timelines on them, deadlines. It says that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, the Attorney General shall, not later than 90 days after the receipt of such a request or question, make a ruling or determination. Well, you think to yourself, if this agency has very little to do and thousands of employees, then perhaps the timeliness of a response from the industry would merit some 90-day deadline. But the senator, in introducing this, completely overlooks the obvious. This legislation would force ATF to take resources and manpower away from their other activities and put them into answering regulatory inquiries with a 90-day deadline in his bill. So what are the other duties that we'll be taking the ATF agents away from? Well, the senator's from Indiana, my neighboring state, and I'm sure when he goes to northwestern Indiana, he hears a lot about the city of Chicago. Well, it was last weekend, on the 4th of July weekend, that there were 104 people shot in the city of Chicago. 19 died. There were 13 children who were shot and 2 law enforcement agents. What is the responsibility of the Alcohol and Tobacco Firearms Agency when it comes to this kind of mass shooting that's taking place in a city I'm honored to represent, but breaks my heart to hear those numbers? They're supposed to be investigating the gun violence. They're supposed to be gathering the information and evidence so they can work with the prosecutors to stop this mass shooting. Unfortunately, the senator from Indiana said, no, that's not your priority at ATF. Your priority is to answer regulatory questions from gun dealers and manufacturers. And you got 90 days to do it, no matter what else is going on. You may be going after somebody who's guilty in a mass killing and a mass shooting. Put it aside. You got a regulatory bookkeeping question. That's one of the provisions in here. We got a bookkeeping question that should take priority over anything else you're doing. Stop preparing information and evidence for trial. Answer the industry questions on regulations. That's your highest priority. At least that's what your bill says. And so I look at this and I think, in the reality of gun violence and death and the crimes that are being committed, ATF has the most important role of keeping us safe. I want them to be efficient in dealing with the industry, but that is not their highest priority as far as I'm concerned. The highest priority is to keep America safe and to do something about gun violence. And for that reason, I object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard. Senator from Indiana.
Madam President. Quick response to that before I ask for unanimous consent on the next item is that argument I hear so often that the city that sports some of the toughest state gun laws and local laws that ends up having the statistics that no one would want to have across our country, and then would try to cast that blame on a neighboring state, tells me that you're looking in the wrong place to solve the problem. The ATF here, we're just wanting clarity. That's the purpose of this act. And I suggest that my friend from Illinois look at some of the more basic issues that might be underlying what's happening there. Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 1916 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered, read a third time, and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Senator from Illinois.
Let me say initially, I did not mention the issue of the source of crime guns in Illinois. The senator from Indiana raised it, and since he did, I want to make a record of it. When we trace the crime guns in Illinois, we find an alarming percentage of them coming from gun shows in your state, right next to Illinois. The bad guys get on the Skyway, drive over to Northwest Indiana gun shows, and buy guns at those shows without background checks and come back and commit crime in Chicago and other neighborhoods. That's a fact. You may not like it, I certainly don't like it, but we ought to be doing something about that instead of worrying about the the gun manufacturers and the gun salesmen and whether or not they're going to get special treatment from this agency. But let me address the second matter that is before us, and this is Senator Braun's request for S. 1916, protecting the right to keep and bear arms. I want to set the record straight at the outset. Current federal law, the Stafford Act, prohibits the federal government from seizing lawfully owned guns during a period of a major disaster or emergency. It's on the books. That's the law. The Stafford Act is also clear that during a major disaster or emergency, the federal government is prohibited from creating new registration requirements for guns, new prohibitions on gun possession, or new prohibitions on the lawful carrying of guns. That's on the books already. So current law already protects guns that people own legally during periods of disaster or emergency. But the senator's bill goes much further than that. Section 4 of the bill would amend the Stafford Act, get this, to say that the federal government also cannot prohibit the manufacture or sale or transfer of guns or ammunition during a disaster or emergency. There are several problems with this. First, current law has exceptions that allow the government to continue enforcing laws already on the books during a disaster. This includes laws that prohibit convicted felons from possessing guns. Your bill does not make that exception. I'm sure you don't want to do that. I hope you'll look at your bill. In other words, under the bill as I read it, during a major disaster or emergency, the government would be barred from prohibiting any gun sales, even from enforcing current prohibitions on the sale of guns to convicted felons. That doesn't make sense. I'm sure that's not what you want to do, but that's what your bill says. I hope it's not what you intended, and I'm sure it's not. So please look at it carefully. Also, there are legitimate reasons why the government might need to temporarily prohibit guns from being sold in a disaster area. Here's something that's not outlandish. Suppose the background check system has been knocked offline in a disaster area. We wouldn't want felons taking advantage of that situation to walk into gun stores and buy guns that they're legally ineligible to buy. Current law ensures that the government can't take anyone's lawfully owned gun during a disaster, but there is no clear justification for granting untouchable status to gun sales during a disaster. This bill needs some work. I hope we don't pass it in a hasty manner, and in light of these and other concerns, I object.
Objection